once in California belonged to Mexico and its lands to Mexicans. A horde of tattered, feverish Americans poured in, and such was their hunger for land that they took the land. Stole Sutter's land, Guerrero's land, took the grants and broke them up, and growled and quarreled over them, those frantic, hungry men, and they guarded with guns the land they had stolen. They put up houses and barns, they turned the earth and planted crops, and these things were possession, and possession was ownership. The Mexicans were weak and fled. They could not resist because they wanted nothing in the world as frantically as the Americans wanted the land. Our program today is called Migrant Roots to a Vibrant Community, a culture that has struggled to overcome the challenges that most of us have accepted as a right rather than a privilege, providing us an insight on how blessed we are to be Americans. These same obstacles created a strength and pride that is unyielding and inspiring to generations that follow. Our program will peek inside the journey of those that were raised differently than yourselves and offer a perspective of how dreams are still realized in this great country. My name is Ed Rodriguez, and I was born in Elsa, Texas. That's in South Texas, where you can literally throw a stone across the border into Mexico. Most people in Plymouth know me as Norma's husband. My beautiful wife of nearly 40 years is very involved in our community and has been working with the Plymouth Community Schools for many years. Together, we strive to help improve the community that we love. Norma and I have been blessed with 4 wonderful children, 3 girls and 1 boy. My kids and I are graduates of Plymouth High School. I graduated in 1982 when we were the kings of basketball. Norma graduated from Wawasee High School, but we're not going to hold that against her. We also have been blessed with 9 grandchildren, 5 girls and 4 boys. God has provided us with the opportunities, and we do all we can to share and help anyone we can to meet a better life. Incidentally, Norma and I are both children of field-working migrant parents who traveled to find better lives for their families. I'd like to provide you with an idea of what we're going to discuss and how the sections will be presented. We're going to look into an introduction to definitions of words, the American dream, the struggles of the journey, the migrant, and how Marshall County began to change, and finally we'll close. As I began to prepare for this event, I started to imagine a 13-year-old boy as he sat at the edge of a river, taking off his worn-out shoes and socks. He sat on the banks of the Rio Grande River, separating Mexico from the United States. His fear quickly faded as he entered the quickly moving river water, his toes clenching the mud in the murky brown water as his arms were raised high to protect his shoes. Tasting the vermin-infested water, he crossed, focusing on his future. Nothing to hold on to as the water pushed his small frame downstream. A 30-foot stretch turned into 100. He finally reached the other side. He'd entered the United States of America. This was my father in 1950. Sorry. 10 years later, he would marry the love of his life, Rebecca. They had 9 children and 40 grandchildren. As we begin, we all want to be on the same page as we hear words that we may wonder what their meaning is and how they come to play in this world. The word asylum is defined as the protection granted by a nation to someone who has left their native country in fear of persecution. These people are forced to leave their native lands because of their race, their religion, their nationality, political strifes, or simply because they belong to a particular social group. An applicant has to provide proof for asylum to be granted and has to arrive at or enter the new country to apply. A refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, natural disasters, conflict, generalized violence, or other circumstances that have seriously disturbed public order and, as a result, required international protection. Immigration is the action of coming to live permanently in a foreign country. In the U.S., there are generally three types of immigration: humanitarian, family-based, and employment-based. It's interesting that the most acceptable form of immigration in the United States is employment-based. Why? I would suggest that it's the need. In other words, we need those people to work for us. Employment-based immigration is not easy. A state must prove to the federal government that all other efforts have been exhausted, including offering these positions to U.S. citizens. An immigrant is a person who comes to live permanently in a foreign country. There are four types of immigration statuses: citizens, residents, non-immigrants, and the undocumented. A migrant is a person who moves from one place to another, especially in order to find work or better living conditions. To put it simply, a migrant is someone who moves temporarily to a new location, while an immigrant is someone who will settle and stay permanent. The Central Americans overwhelming the U.S.-Mexican border are the Hondurans, the Guatemalans, the Salvadorians, now the Venezuelans, the Haitians. Many are fleeing drug and gang-fueled violence back home. Whether they are immigrants or refugees is very significant for asylum purposes. There are four types of immigration: immigration, emigration, external migration, and internal migration. We will be focusing on internal migration for this presentation. It should be mentioned that there are many forms of work permits through governmental agencies. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds about this, but here are some examples: green cards for permanent residency, temporary work visas, seasonal work visas, and exchange work visas. The application is made in their home country, which could take up to 10 years. A citizen in the U.S. could sponsor someone, but it will still take over 10 years. I'd like to just touch on the subject of our current border situation using three words and defining those words. The word issue is defined as an important topic or debate for discussion. A concern is defined as a matter of interest, anxiety, or worry. A crisis is defined as a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger when a difficult or important decision must be made. How Americans define the situation is up to each and every one of us. I would encourage you to take the time to analyze the events that are taking place in their countries. The dangers stem from governmental corruption, extreme fear, from gang violence, drugs, human trafficking, rape, and even death. You should be aware that these immigrants do not want to leave their beloved countries and families behind. I want to shift your attention to why those that seek to immigrate to the United States do so. Above all else, It is the pursuit of the American dream. The American dream is defined as the ideal by which equality of opportunity is available to any American, allowing the highest aspirations and goals to be achieved. Expatriating from other countries into the United States is a long and difficult process. We talk about brain drain in our local communities. These second and third world countries cannot afford to allow brain drain and thus make it nearly impossible to allow their brightest and best to leave. Those that choose to immigrate seek opportunity in this great land and risk the long journey and all of the risks that are associated with it. These people are paying thousands of dollars to human traffickers known as coyotes and risk their very lives being vulnerable to these criminals to care for them, all the while focused on the aspirations that they will find a better life in the United States of America. They are allowed to come on credit. This debt is owed to the coyotes, and if not paid, there will be severe consequences. Along the way, they experience the unmentionables: starvation, thirst, sleep deprivation, the weather, including the scorching sun, rain, snow, temperature extremes during the day and into the night. They are pushed to the very brink of their existence as they walk the hundreds of miles. When they finally arrive, and by whatever means necessary, cross into the United States, they experience torment at the hands of our own. They find themselves as indentured servants on farms, inhumane treatment in an attempt to break their spirits, the prejudgment and cruelty as they try to simply work and live. Please keep in mind that we're not only describing men and women, but also the children. The immigrants are doing the jobs that we are no longer willing to do. They're picking our vegetables and fruits. They're working in slaughterhouses and meat packing factories, poultry production farms, dairy and beef production farms, pork production farms. There are many other jobs like this that have been classified as poor paying, dangerous, and left for those on the margins of society. The margins of society are left to the vulnerabilities and exploitation of immoral employers and coyotes who smuggle them across the border. The margins of society is where you'll find the forgotten people, those who have been left behind, the poor, the uneducated, susceptible to crime, and unfortunately found in all corners of the world. Let's move toward the task at hand, the migrant. The migrant is a beautiful story. It includes sufferings, struggles, abuse, culture, music, celebrations, and moves through a movement that helps shape people into their faith and family-oriented lives. The migrant has always revolved around their faith in God, their family, and their work. Migrants move from state to state, living in horrific conditions that we would easily classify as inhumane. Many migrant families were U.S. citizens that lived in impoverished areas with little industry, and the only way to survive was to leave, to find work during seasonal opportunities. Migrants would travel from their homes in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, primarily to the north, where they could find work as manual labor on farms. Migrants have been around since the turn of the 20th century. The largest population of migrants began during and after the world wars. While our men were overseas fighting, the women took up tools and began working in factories to supply the war efforts and sustain the country. In the meantime, there was an extreme shortage of manual labor. In those days, Machinery did not exist like we have now. And so humans were needed in the fields to plant, care for the fields, and to harvest the produce. In 1942, the United States and Mexico created the Bracero Project. Bracero means manual labor. This encouraged Mexicans to come as contract laborers. The Bracero was paid low wages and often worked in conditions that U.S. citizens simply would not accept. Braceros were treated very poorly. We're all very familiar with the sufferings of our African American brothers and sisters. The Braceros were treated even worse, but those abuses were never documented and were never seen on television. As the migrants left their homes, they traveled hundreds of miles in open cargo trucks, partially covered by tarps to protect them from the elements. The trucks had a platform built where the migrants would stand the entire way and sleep wherever and however they could on the journey. Their personal belongings would be stored under these platforms, and the migrant families would ride on top of the platform. Stops for bathroom breaks were only decided by the owner of the truck. Stops were always met with disdain by the business owners, as they were unwelcomed wherever they went. Each family would pay the owner of the truck for the transportation and was truly at the mercy of that individual. Those that were fortunate and able to save money over time owned their own vehicles and would make the trip in caravans following the trucks. Remember that the highways were not 4-lane like we're accustomed to today. There were no Loves or Pilot truck stops. The roads were 2-lane highways that cut through the states, and gas stations were not available like we have now nearly every 20 miles. Restaurants were not abundant. The gas stations and restaurants that were available did not want these migrant travelers to stop, as it was bad for business. The work could be found in Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, all across the Midwest and into the state of Washington. The harvest was tomatoes, pickles, potatoes, carrots, onions, celery, beets, lettuce, asparagus, apples, strawberries, blueberries, and many other fruits and vegetables. Those in Texas would return to harvest the cotton as the seasons turned. When the migrant families arrived, they were introduced to their new homes. This is really hard to fathom, and I ask that you start to imagine this as I describe it. Most of our living rooms measure 14 by 14, so about 200 square feet. So pretend that you have 3 children. Perhaps your family's expecting a 4th, but for this scenario, we're going to use 5 family members. So you're standing in the doorway of this 200 square foot room, and you have 3 questions that you want to ask yourself. Where will we sleep? Where will we cook? And where will we eat? In that small room. Now, if you have a family of 7 or more, chances are very high that they're going to bump you up into a larger room. That room typically would measure 18 feet by 18 feet. So we're talking about 325 square feet for a family of 7 to sleep, eat, and cook their meals. If you're like most people, you start to wonder, well, wait a minute, what about the restroom? And where will I shower? Well, the farms were set up with community showers, open and without walls to allow for privacy. The restrooms were the same, but they had walls, just no doors. The restrooms were really fancy Joy Johns. And by community, we mean that it was for the entire migrant population on the farm. Good news is that they were separate. The men had their facilities and the women had their facilities. Hot water was not a priority. If you were an early riser, you may enjoy some warm water with your shower. If you slept in, you'd be ready for a very quick and cold shower. The migrant families were responsible for bringing their own personal items, including their clothing, bed linens, and blankets. Each family also needed to bring pots, pans, plates, glasses for their new home. Bringing other items such as toys and books, pets, furniture. Couldn't do that. There was no room in the truck, and there was less room in the house. The homes were called barracas, or barracks, as they were military style, in rows, and typically joined by common walls. The larger families were placed in the few smaller houses found on the farm on a first come, first served, and as needed basis. The living quarters evolved from this style to dilapidated old mobile home arrangements over time. Because of the community facilities, water was not present in the living quarters. The only running water was found at the community facilities. It was normal to see people walking back and forth in the early morning hours to bring water to the home in buckets or large pots for personal use. This was also used for food preparation, and so several trips needed to be made. You can imagine standing in line at that hour was just brutal. The camps would have a patron, or a boss. The patron was in charge of the crew and was also in charge of setting up the hours for work. Usually, it was the same owner of the truck that had a relationship with the farm owner, whom we called el viejo. The patron would inform all of the families of the hour that the truck would depart the camp for the fields. If you missed the truck, you missed work for the day, and risked being asked to leave the camp with nowhere to go and no vehicle to take you anywhere. Seldom did someone miss the truck. The hours were long at times, from dusk to dawn with an hour for lunch and rest. If the fields were not near the camp, the patron would want to leave earlier to account for the drive. The work week consisted of Monday through Friday and then Saturday until just after noon. I truly don't know what the relationship was between the patron and with el viejo, or the farm owner, but the patron was not expected to work. Rather, his job was to be vigilant and ensure that the crews went to the right fields, make sure that they were working, and make sure that the product was not being mishandled, damaged, or stolen. I've always felt that el viejo was being paid by the patron to bring people from the south and paying him to watch over the crew. The patron was usually an individual that was respected and had the luxury of having the large truck to transport the people. You never heard anyone talking down to the patron. Working manual labor in the fields on a farm is back-breaking work. It's just as hard on the hands, the legs, the neck, and the feet. This is one place that the migrant worker would cherish the youth in the family. They were much younger. We should mention that even though there were some labor laws in place, nobody was going to enforce nor argue some type of abuse towards the children. Children as young as 6 and 7 were expected to work and to produce at a pace similar to the adult. If not, the parent would typically scold the child for the lack of production. It was not an option that the children produce. It was a necessity. This is one of the reasons why many migrant parents would have large families. If you remember back to your college days when money was scarce and hunger never left, you probably became a ramen noodle junkie. Why the ramen noodle? Well, it's easy to prepare and it's cheap. Migrants, and still to this day, our culture has always pursued the same menu: pinto beans, rice, chicken, ground beef, corn or flour tortillas, all served up with a cold glass of Kool-Aid. This entire menu is easy and quick to prepare, but more importantly, very inexpensive. Every day before and after work, the women would rise early and prepare the meal for the fields. the preparation of the dough for the tortillas, the beans boiling over the 2-burner stove in the corner while the coffee would be brewing and being poured into thermos containers for the day. This was a daily ritual, except on Sunday. I can still remember my aunt who had 7 kids, 6 boys and a daughter, making stacks of tortillas that would easily measure 12 inches tall. She would work for an hour preparing those tortillas, only to see them eaten in a matter of minutes by those boys. I always felt bad for her daughter Lupe, because on her shoulders fell the task of having to help my aunt in all the food preparations and still have to work in the fields while her brothers got to sleep in a few extra minutes. While I'm on the subject of food, I want to share my own personal story of how I struggled in using utensils. Truth be told, I still can't tell you the difference between the forks and the knives and the spoons when we go to a fancy meal. I'm sure I've embarrassed my wife several times, and so I guess I need to apologize to her for that. But why the struggle? Our culture has always used tortillas as the utensils to eat. So we will take a tortilla and tear small portions of it, and we will create our own spoons and use those to capture our food and eat with our hands. I'll tell you what, I was in high school when I started considering maybe I should learn to use utensils like a fork, a spoon, and a knife. Now, arriving at the fields to work at 7 a.m. is really disheartening. I've been there, and I can tell you that it's a real swift kick in the gut. You're standing in a dew-riddled, waist-high row of plants. Your clothes are soaked. And if you made the mistake of wearing tennis shoes, your shoes and socks are now soaking wet. You decided that sleep was a little more important, and you didn't get a breakfast taco, and so now you're hungry. In the meantime, those around you are already hard at it, and you have no other choice than to get in and start working. Aside from working, you're always mindful and watching out for the patron, el viejo, and snakes. I would venture to guess that the scariest feeling in the world is having a snake slither across your hand, arm, or feet. As the day progresses, the sun begins to beat down, and by 10 o'clock, your clothes and shoes have begun to dry. Just before lunch break, you start to feel the heat, the humidity, and it's wearing you down. Finally, the lunch hour, and the patron calls for everyone to stop working. It won't be long, he'll be pushing everyone back to work. Out in the fields, there's no microwave oven. You're not going to find a vending machine that's going to dispense a sandwich, soda pop, or candy. Rather, wrapped in aluminum foil, you will find the meal for the family. Mom was already up at 4 or 5 in the morning preparing the meal for her family. Lunch is generally tacos with a variety of fillings. Migrants can be very creative in the meal preparation in order to prevent the monotony of their lives. Tacos can be beans with eggs, eggs with diced potatoes, eggs with diced potatoes and Spam. We typically eat chili peppers with our meals. Could be jalapenos, serranos, chile del monte. On Mondays, it was common to enjoy lunch tacos from the leftover Sunday family dinner. Those were always excellent. We didn't have pizza, we didn't have hamburgers, anything fancy like this. But I'll tell you that still to this day, those are the best tacos in the world. The conditions in the fields were very difficult. Aside from the dewy mornings and the snakes were the elements. Working your body nonstop while someone is watching over you in the blazing sun is rough. Believe it or not, the best production against the sun, even when the humidity is 80% and the temperature is in the 90s, is a long sleeve shirt, a large brimmed hat, and a bandana to protect your neck. Some of the produce requires that gloves be worn to prevent blisters, cuts, thorns, and infections. Imagine the heat, the attire, and bending down, and at times having to work on your knees for hours. In the tomato fields, we would use wooden baskets, and then came the plastic crates that would hold about a bushel or so of tomatoes, which I would guess weighs about 15 pounds. A worker would fill that bushel basket and have to walk to the truck where men were filling the truck to take the tomatoes to the processing plant. That walk at times could be 300 yards. It wouldn't be a brisk walk. Remember, the patron is watching. The produce would sometimes have been recently sprayed with pesticides, and there was the presence of chemicals in the air. Many people, especially the women, would wear masks to cover their noses to prevent illnesses. Again, there was no regulation or any protection for the migrant worker. The farm owner knew that this was dangerous, but didn't seem to care. Today, pesticides are a grave concern for our farm workers, and there are real advocates fighting for justice to protect our migrant workers. It's been found that these pesticides were carcinogenic and have caused internal organ failures when inhaled or ingested. Migrant workers were dying by the age of 50, and this was allowed. Again, we were on the margins of society. On top of the hardships in the fields were the dishonest patron, the crooked farm owner, el viejo, and then the weigh scales. On farms where migrants were paid by the weight, each worker would have their work production weighed on a scale, and the tally would be kept by the patron. Now, it's important to remember that nobody has said that the patron was educated, but because he was in contact with el viejo, he was also given the responsibility of keeping track of production and thus pay to each individual worker. El viejo paid el patron. El patron paid the migrant. If the total production reported and paid by el viejo to the patron was 4 tons, then one would think that 4 tons worth of pay would land in the hands of the migrants. That was not always the case. Both the patron and el viejo knew that the migrant had no legal recourse, and thus abusive pay was prevalent. My mother told us many, many times of the abuses they would experience, where they would witness the patron's foot holding up the weigh scale to give less weight to the production right in front of the workers. Miscalculated figures could not be challenged, and who lost always was the migrant. This is where I find that the irony comes in. You would think that the migrant would be extremely upset, perhaps not want to produce, perhaps walk off the job, but you would be mistaken. The faith that the migrants had in their God was far superior to the misfortunes of being cheated. They learned that the best path to take was to accept it and continue working for the sake of their families. Now, I don't know about you, but that is inspirational. Why would someone allow others to abuse them by cheating them out of their hard work and pay? Simply put, is their faith in God and the strong belief that the Virgen de Guadalupe, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus was always looking over them. If you've ever had the opportunity to walk into the home of a Hispanic family, you will see religion. If you've ever sat in a car with a Hispanic, you will see religion. Our faith is constantly with us and near and dear to our minds and hearts. We tend to pray when things are bad and we have a plea. We also pray when things are good and we're thankful. The The migrant worker lived in faith. Secondly, their family is the most important thing on this earth to them. A migrant would never risk something happening to their families. Abuses can be overcome. Loss can be replaced. But family, no. Hispanics have also traditionally and continually respected their elders. Agree or not, the elder has the word and the decision. The elders also take great care and caution to make sure that the decision that is being made for the family. Work is necessary and vital to our existence. Yet it's not worth arguing with an individual that is trying to steal your money and then want to take your dignity. We believe in turning the other cheek. We talked about the work schedule, but Saturday afternoon was party time. Those community showers were bustling when work let out on Saturday. The entire crew would dress in their fancy clothes, and the women would want to go grocery shopping. The men would want to go buy beer, and the kids wanted to play and ask for snacks. Sundays would be a day of sleeping in, going to church, and just rest for the week ahead. Often, visitors and family would come and break the dull routine of the camp. No matter the day, you would always hear the music playing from the barracks. Despite all the strains that life brought, migrants were never without música. Our famous musicians would catapult us with their music to other thoughts, their baladas, talking about romance. The corridos would tell us stories about the going-ons at the border and the bandits and the mafia. Those that were lucky enough to find magazines in Spanish passed them around for all to read. But I would argue that nothing held the farm in suspense more than lucha libre. You may remember the days of Bobby Heenan and Dick the Bruiser. This was wrestling when we grew up. Migrants followed wrestling and boxing. Boxing is a sport where Mexicans have excelled for years. I remember listening to the men argue and defend their boxers and their wrestlers. You wouldn't see any bets because nobody wanted to risk losing their meager wages, but it was fun to listen to them argue. It seems now that all at once things started to change. The migrant parents began to realize that their children were growing up without a proper education. Although there were programs that the churches and other groups would put on that would offer daycare and tutoring, it was not the path that they wanted in order for real progress. We talked about the Bracero program that began in 1942. It finally came to an end in 1964. Before this, however, the parents began having conversations about remaining in place so that the children would have a proper education year-round. The emphasis began to be very focused on the children and their educational needs. At the same time in California, a young man by the name of Cesar Chavez was fighting for justice for migrant workers in the grape industry. Alongside him was a woman by the name of Dolores Huerta. It was a time when our country was at odds racially. The migrants were stuck in the middle, and their families as well. We learned to be proud of Cesar Chavez and his work. We were united, and we called ourselves Chicanos. We wore it like a badge of honor to be a Mexican American. This is when things began to change in Marshall County. Although there were already a handful of migrant families that had planted roots here, a wave of migrants began to settle in Plymouth. Many took on factory jobs all across the county. foundries, and assembly line work was available. Those that took these jobs stayed until they retired after 30 years plus of work. I'd like to reference and acknowledge the great work that the Wythogan Valley Preservation Council has done putting together this book about Marshall County. I point to pages 56, 57, and 58. Highly recommend you pick up one of these books. In these pages, you will find some of the companies that brought in the migrant workers and even some of the locations of the migrant camps. Please, bear with me as I pay homage to our migrant pioneers that had the courage to alter the lives for their children. And I apologize to those families who I overlooked because it is not on purpose. I'd like to give credit to Irma Elizondo, Maria Soria, Trine Fonseca, and Elizabeth Garza, and others that helped compile this information. I have a list of people here, and some of them have dates. Joe Martinez stayed here in 1952. Armando Tapia, 1955. Manuel Salazar, 1957. Ray Salazar, 1957. Basilio Fuentes, 1958. Rafael Garza, 1956. Luis Sarasua, 1954. Israel Fonseca, 1961. Pedro Vasquez, 1961. Miguel Sanchez, 1962. Marta Garcia Hall, 1962. Jose Salazar, 1962. Manuel Briones, 1962. Ralph Ruiz, 1964. Marcelino Mata, 1965. Pablo Briones, 1965. Santiago Vela, 1965. Domingo Cabrera, 1966. Alejandro Peña, 1966. Manuel Marquez, 1967. Jose Rodriguez, 1967. Jesus Mendoza, 1969. Lázaro Flores, 1972. Antonio Soria, 1973. Jose Reina, 1961. I'd also like to acknowledge Jose Castro, Jesus Silva, Celestino Lopez, Ramon Salazar, Raúl Llanes, Juan Muñoz, who was sitting back there, Sam Valdez, Manuel Rodriguez, Domingo Robles, Federico Chavez, Manuel Guerrero, Tony Arroyo, Jose Dueñez, Narciso Olivares, whose daughter and son are sitting right back there, thank you. Manuel Costilla, Cayetano Olivares, Juan Pérez, Ambrosio Olivares, Álvaro Flores, Cristobal de la Paz, and Martín Hernández. If I called out your father or mother's name, I want to thank you, and hopefully you are proud of the legacy that they've left behind. They endured a struggle that is immeasurable to us. Despite all of the obstacles that were placed in their paths, the migrant families have the courage to forgive and forget the past. They focus on the future and simply learned how to improve their lives. The main emphasis is placed on the children. The education of their children has taken center stage. The one thing that was never shaken was their faith in God and their love of family. They honed their skills and always had a work ethic second to none. To say that the migrant won in the end is an untruth. The struggle is real, but united in the culture and pride of our ancestors maintains our dignity. In that dignity lies our strength. We are better people because of what we have endured. The migrant children, now parents, learned that the key is education. We now have children with migrant pasts that continue with technical school training, associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and PhDs. Our children work in a vast array of fields too numerous to mention. No matter where you turn, a person will encounter another with migrant roots. Our children went from the fields of labor to career fields. I would be remiss if I didn't mention those that went and fought in our nation's wars. Although society mistreated them, they went and fought for our freedoms. Migrants volunteered for wars and have lost their lives in other countries, just like many other brave Americans. May God bless those soldiers that gave all. If you are a veteran, we thank you. Today, our communities have grown in population. According to a recent study, the Hispanic population in Plymouth went from 14% in the year 2000 to 25% in the year 2019. Our African American population went from 0.63 to 1.7%. We've also seen more Asian Americans entering our community. We are living in a beautiful and diverse community. We would encourage you to embrace the change and make this our community, a more vibrant one, full of color, music, culture, and harmony. You've learned the struggles that generations of people before us endured from many countries around the globe. If you, like myself, were blessed to be born in this great land, then I encourage you to look deep into your souls and accept others that are less fortunate. Welcome them into your homes. Break bread with them and allow them to learn from you and you from them. Listen to their stories and do the same in their homes. Look into their eyes and you will see the strength and pride that drives them. Take a moment to praise their children and support their efforts. They are in a pursuit of a dream that perhaps was handed to us. It's also likely that it's the same dream that you yourself fought for or are fighting for. Nonetheless, as Jesus instructed us in Matthew chapter 25, verse 40, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of my brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. I want to thank you on behalf of our people for taking the time to listen to these words. It's been a long journey, and we're still traveling. We are a part of this community. Some were born here. Some have had children born here. Some of us work here. Others work in other towns, but we spend our money here. We care for your children. We care for you. We care for your elders. Let's shake hands and embrace one another. Thank you very much.
We'll take questions, and as anybody that has any questions, I'm sure Ed would be happy to answer. And we also have copies of that book, so if you want one, they are free. We're going to get them out, and you can take one as you go. I think it's a great book.
It is a good one. Adam, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you, Nick, for that. Just if you could give us an idea of, do you have any idea of how many of those migrant workers ended up staying versus the portion that returned, and what was the process from a paperwork and legality standpoint at that time?
So I think one of the interesting facts is, I don't know if anybody knows, but my wife, Norma, and I, we're working on a documentary right now to tell the story of the migrant and of the immigrant. And so we learned through this investigation and interviewing folks that the majority of the migrants were actually already U.S. citizens. And so they were simply moving from state to state for employment opportunities. So the number of folks, that's part of this project, is to find out specifically how many folks stayed back in the 60s and the 50s. So we're working on compiling that information right there. you'd be surprised that it was not a large number. Most folks, I don't know if you know the state of Texas, but it's the best in the world. Because I was born there, that's why I say that. So, as I said in my presentation, folks really, they don't want to relocate. They don't want to come to the United States. It's the great land of opportunity. But if anybody has traveled Mexico, you know how beautiful Mexico is. We now have a lot of folks from Honduras and Central America. If you've ever been to those countries, they're just magnificent countries. They have mountains, they have snow, they have beaches. I mean, just beautiful. The food, the culture, the music, the art, everything is there. They come because it's a need. So to answer your question, the majority of the folks did not stay. The majority of the folks you will still find in South Texas and down in the border states. And I did want to recognize Juan Munoz, if you could stand up. He's one of the pioneers that I mentioned. I'd also like to recognize Joe and Mina. Their father, Narciso Olivares, was one of the gentlemen that, give him a round of applause. Narciso, we used to call Chicho, was one of the great leaders of our community that feverishly helped people. No matter what, no matter when, he would take the time to help people. He was a great counselor for people. So, we have been doing a lot of stuff internally. Michelle, I think you've been involved with us a little bit. Norma and I started a group called La Voz Unida. Well, actually, she started it. I'm just a member. But La Voz Unida recognizes, some of the pitfalls that the immigrants that are coming into our community have. And so we're trying to help and raise them and educate them and really integrate them into the community. We were recently at a talk, can't remember Sister Norma's last name, but she's a nun that spoke in Notre Dame. And she was talking primarily about what's taken place in our communities. Every community across the country is seeing an influx of immigrants. And I would encourage you, I still have these words with me because it was just impactful. I think, we tend to think that, this is a burden on the community and this and that, and it's really not. Sister Norma advised us to do the right thing and just ask people, are you okay? Welcome. Just those simple things encourage people to become better people and integrate into our communities. So I would ask that we all try and do that and recognize that, we're all God's people. And we need to recognize this, and we need to, as I said, we need to live in harmony. And I love Plymouth. I think that everybody works together. I mean, when we have a hiccup, we work through it. And that's why I think Plymouth is awesome, Marshall County is awesome. So thank you so much.
We actually have plenty of these books that he recommended. So if we run out, we'll get more. So anybody that would like to have one, they are here. They are beautiful and very interesting. It's kind of a coffee table book. You pick up and you can go through it. And it's got lots of great information as well. So, like I say, if I run out, I'll run and get more. And don't forget the things that are coming up. And next month, please do not forget that our brown bag is going to be on the first Friday. It's always been on the second Friday. Next month it's on the first Friday, okay? So I don't want anybody to miss it because they forgot. So thank you again for coming. We just love having you, and we hope you'll come back for our grand opening. And we're hoping that you're going to enjoy the new transportation room. It's going to tell a much fuller story of the history of Marshall County, and we're very proud of that.